Hi, everybody. My name is Buddy Gott. Welcome to today's episode of Gotta Pop. I'm excited about the show for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've got my friend Roland Denzel here. Hi, Roland. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm also excited because although this is the 10th episode of Gotta Pop, this is the first one that I'm doing that I'm going to have both an audio version and then a video version on YouTube. So I thank you, Roland, for being a part of that. This is kind of fun. I used to do a show years ago on YouTube called Buddy's Writing Show where I would interview writers and I've kind of missed that. So it's going to be fun to do this here on YouTube. So again, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks
And
for having me. I brushed
oh,
my hair just for you.
it looks great. It really
Thank you.
looks great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And I just want to let people know a little bit about you. I've known you for probably close to 10 years now. I know we were parts of the same writing communities online. We used to follow the self-publishing podcast
Yeah.
that was done by
Johnny, Sean, and
Johnny.
Dave.
Yeah, Johnny, Sean, and Dave. I think that's maybe where I got to know you. Then there was the other one too. I forget what it was. The one that Carl Sinclair and some others did.
Oh,
But
yeah. The something round table.
yes, the self-publishing
Self-publishing round.
roundtable. Yeah, but so you are a writer. You've got multiple books out, and I wanted to let people know too. They should check out you on Facebook, Instagram, the Indestructible Author. You give wonderful, inspiring advice there, and I know people can, you know, that people can learn a lot for you. You've helped me out a lot with things that you've posted, and I encourage writers and everyone else to just check out your stuff online.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome.
Yeah, yeah.
And one thing other than writing that you and I have in common is a love of music. We have talked and bonded over music many, many times over the years. And when we talked about doing the show together today, I know I had asked you maybe to give me an album that you maybe thought was underrated or maybe a favorite album. And I know you had in mind a group that we both love, and that is Pink Floyd. You've been a fan for a while, I guess, right? But you, like me, your fandom has changed a little over the years.
Yeah, I had a stepfather. I don't know the years, but my stepfather was not, he was 13 years older than me.
Hmm.
So, and so he and my mother were into a totally different types of music, right? They liked, but he liked the music that she liked, and she didn't know anything about his music. But he introduced me to, he had a bunch of albums and he said, you can listen to them whenever you want. And it was like, Deep Purple, Supertramp,
Oh, nice.
ELO, Pink Floyd, and things like that. And like at first, I was just like, I don't know any of these bands. And then, but he would play Pink Floyd more than others, and then I sort of got hooked into it. And then when when I grew up, moved out into the world. Had developed this love for Pink Floyd and discovered that, oh, their early stuff was so different from their current stuff from the late 70s, right?
Right. Yeah, much, much different.
Much different. And so got into it. I have a tendency to, like, when I like a band or a book or something or an author, I like kind of dig into their past stuff too, right? And like I want to see how they've changed and how they've morphed over time. And I don't always love the past stuff, but I love knowing about it. I
Yeah,
love
that's how
having,
I am too. I kind of
yeah.
I always say that I kind of geek out or nerd out over bands or singers when I get into them, when I discover them, and something of theirs hits me and I love it, and I love that too. I love learning the whole history. I'll go to like Wikipedia pages and websites and just learn as much as I can. And oh, so many bands, especially ones that came out in that time period, have very, very interesting histories, and not just in like how the bands were formed, but in how they changed over the years. And Pink Floyd, like you said, is a great example of that. Their
You've
first album. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you've seen Spinal Tap, right?
Oh yeah, I love Spinal
Okay.
Tap.
So I think a lot of people who have seen Spinal Tap, they would, they see here's a metal band, you know, and then they show these clips of them from the 60s,
Yes.
the Thamesmen. Had a different name, the Thamesmen. And
Yeah.
they're like in these like sort of like these 60s tight suits with the short hair, and one has the shaggy hair, and they sing like super like hippy dippy kind of like poppy kind of psychedelic kind of music.
I remember because the one song that I remember them showing in the movie was "Listen to What the Flower People Say," which
Yeah,
couldn't be much more further removed from Big Bottom that came
I
later
know.
than anything.
I know. And it's crazy. So people like I remember people thinking, "Oh, that's ridiculous that somebody would have that." And I'm like, actually like that's a lot like Pink Floyd is, right?
Yeah,
So like Pink Floyd's not metal, but it's like they're super serious music later. And then you
right.
go back into Pink Floyd's early days and they're wearing like fur coats and big floppy hats and
Yeah.
cravats and like big crazy mustaches
I
and
yes, remember when I first started seeing those pictures too, and I was kind of blown away because I'm like, oh, this is because they're a band too that, especially in their later works, they very rarely would have their pictures even on their albums. So you wouldn't see the band a whole lot. And obviously, back in the 70s, there weren't a lot of music videos being made and things like along those lines. So when I went back like you and saw those pictures from the 60s, I'm like, wow, these guys are much, much different than I would have guessed.
Yeah, yeah. And the music back then is just crazy. So, like, I'm not going to say that anyone who likes the most popular Pink Floyd would like those things, but they will
Hmm.
probably like to have heard them at least
Yes,
once or twice. There's
I
just
think you're right.
some crazy sounding, super psychedelic stuff with harpsichords and
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, and actually, as much as I love Pink Floyd, because I got into them, I guess I was a little late in some ways in getting into them. I didn't really have my first Pink Floyd album until I was 21 or 22. And that was around the time that they had just gotten back together with their Momentary Lapse of Reason album, which was the
mm,
first thing without Roger Waters. And of course, that was in a lot of ways very different because Roger Waters was not in the band. And I ended up loving that album. If people aren't familiar with it, it had a big hit on it called Learning to Fly, and then another one on The Turning Away. A lot of great music on there, but that was much different than the stuff that was in the 70s, like The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. But then what came in the 60s at first, prior to Dark Side of the Moon, was, very, very much different. Like you said, the first album was The Piper at the Gates of Dawn,
yeah,
and that one I have to say I'm not a big fan of that. I bought
no,
it because I'm sort of a completist and I wanted to have all the Pink Floyd albums, but I listened to it a few times back in the '90s, and I don't think I've played it in its entirety since then. A little too psychedelic. I don't mind psychedelic
yeah,
music, but that's not my Pink Floyd.
yeah. I can still hear it going through my head right now, but I'm like, I don't really want to hear it going through my head. Like it's like I'll get another earworm later, but it's super crazy. But I think a lot of it, just the day that it's very indicative of the music of the day,
Yes.
of the psychedelic bands. And they were definitely psychedelic. I mean, they had a different lead singer back then,
Yeah, Sid Barrett.
Sid Barrett.
He
And
was sort of their leader. I mean, writing all the songs or the
yeah,
majority of the songs, much
yeah,
different. And
yeah, for sure.
of course, he left the band. Well, I don't know how if everybody knows this, but he had some serious drug problems and also some mental issues as well. Um, and that led to him leaving the band. Actually, he only was on a little bit of their second album, which which was A Saucer Full of Secrets. And at that point, David Gilmour had joined the band. And then after that one, Sid Barrett was gone. And then the sound kept changing. And at first, it was sort of, it was different, as we already said, from what came later in the 70s when Roger Waters became the primary songwriter. And with those albums after A Saucer Full of Secrets, you had the musicians, co-writing the songs much more frequently. David
Mhm.
Gilmour was getting into writing songs, Richard Wright as well, and it was interesting because a lot of it was you could tell they were just jamming like on a couple of the things.
Yeah.
And I like those. There's one album towards the beginning. Well, let's go to this one first. You mentioned an album to me just the other day that I'm not super familiar with, but it was another soundtrack to the movie More. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty good, but obviously it's I know in part because it's a soundtrack, it's different than what came later, but musically it's well, I don't know. I like a lot of the things on there.
I do too, but there's like a mixture. There's like, I really
Yeah.
like this song. I'm gonna skip this next one because they're,
Yes.
like on the second one because they're just like crazy psychedelic musical numbers.
Yeah.
It's like just, and you can tell in that regard that it was probably just we needed some music for this part of a movie, a dramatic part of the
Yes.
movie, right?
It is very hit or miss. The good stuff is really good. Then there's other ones too that I'm fine never hearing again.
Yeah, so I think Cymbeline and is on that album, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think you're right.
And Green is the color. So I think for me, those are the two standout songs
Yeah,
on
those are
there.
good. Those are
So
really
like,
good.
so if they were on like a best of album, you'd be like, oh, this is good early Pink
Yeah,
Floyd, right? I can
right.
see how
Exactly.
they, how they could have been. But then the other ones, you'd be like, what's going on?
Exactly. And I found that too with the majority of their early albums that for the most part, I can't put on them and listen to them in their entirety without wanting to skip songs. There were I think it was 7 albums before The Dark Side of the Moon. I think
Mhm.
it's around there. It's around there. So one we're going to focus on a lot today is the Obscured by Clouds album, and that was their 7th album, and then after that came Dark Side. But yeah, actually Obscured by Clouds, which came out in 1972, I would say of their earlier albums, the pre Dark Side of the Moon albums, it's obviously well, it's my favorite of those, but it's the only one really I can listen to in its entirety without wanting
Mm.
to skip songs.
The first one that I can listen to in its entirety without is Metal.
Oh gosh, I forgot about metal. Okay, I
Yeah.
sometimes get the order of them mixed up.
Well,
Yes,
it's
I
weird
agree with
because
you.
I think Obscured by Clouds was actually recorded before Metal. So Metal was like, hey, let's write. We have these ideas. So it took them years to record Dark Side of the Moon,
Hmm.
and so in that time they recorded Obscured by Clouds. But that was like they went there and hurry up, let's make this soundtrack, right?
Yeah, it
Right,
was
and
recorded
then
really quickly, from what I recall.
yeah, and then it takes a while for a movie to come out. So like it was released at the same time as the movie. So it was probably written and recorded before Metal. And then so Metal was a lot of the so you can I feel like if you listen like the order you would listen if you want to hear the journey, you would go Metal and then Dark Side of the Moon.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah, I
Metal
think that's a good.
has the one long and it's as close to I mean, I don't really see how Dark Side of the Moon is a concept album so much as because except for the fact that the songs are connected, they fade in and out or and overlap each
Yes,
other. But
I
I don't
agree with
see a
you.
unifying concept like The Wall is a unifying concept.
Yeah,
But
I see it very, very often referred to as being a concept album, but I've never viewed it that way either. I mean, I don't know if it's because a lot of people think it's got a reputation, of course, for being an album that people can kind of zone out and listen to, or maybe get
mhm,
stoned and listen to, which has never been my thing. But yeah, I don't really view that as a concept album either. And yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, metal. I love metal quite a bit too. And I think what's interesting about, well, there were some things I heard on Metal which remind me a little bit of some of the things like on Obscured by Clouds. You mentioned the long epic song on Metal, and that's Echoes. That's the one it ends
yeah,
with, and I think it's close to 20 minutes long, and that's one of my favorite songs by
yeah,
Floyd. I've seen them a few. I was lucky enough to see them a few times in concert, and they did it every time I saw them, and it was just amazing. And where I was going to say the similarity to me is that one thing I love about that song is you had the vocals shared by David Gilmour and Richard Wright on there. Most of the song is instrumental, but
mhm,
there's some great verses on there. And there's a couple times on Obscured by Clouds where you hear them singing together, particularly on the song Burning Bridges. And I just love the way that their voices sounded together. And
yeah,
unfortunately, after Obscured by Clouds, you really didn't hear that as much because it was getting more into the Roger Waters led era of the band, where it was I don't know. There seemed to be a lot less participation in a lot of ways, and not always to the liking of the majority of the band members.
yeah. Well, I think later on, as we see, like in later albums, with once Roger Waters started singing, like
Hmm.
his voice is such a dramatic shift from the other two, right?
It is.
That I
It
think
is.
they used it thematically, right? So, like when I'm going to be, we could probably use the word bleak too much, often in this, but like bleaker, more serious. harsher topics. I think that's where Roger Waters, really almost like I'm saying it like it is. Here's
Yeah,
my voice, and he's got an interesting voice, so
he does.
that's for sure. And I'm one of my favorite lyricists ever.
Oh, he's a fantastic lyricist, and but I think you really hit the nail on the head there with the bleakness, because his a lot of his stuff did deal with his own struggles. For example, well, it's there's a lot of his stuff that has to deal with his father being killed in World War II. I mean, The Wall is very much centered around that, and the Final Cut album too, which was the last one that he did with Pink Floyd, was like that. And interestingly, the first mention of what happened to his father happened on this album, Obscured by Clouds, with a song called Free For, which is
Hmm.
it was actually the only single that was released from Obscured by Clouds. And it's an interesting song because musically it's very upbeat. It's got a really peppy sound. You listen to it and you're like, oh, what a happy little song. But then he's singing about his
Yeah,
father getting killed. And I think it's a great song, though. I know I'm here laughing talking about it, but if people have never heard that, I encourage them to check it out. I encourage them to check out this whole album. I know you and I have both said, and I think we both surprised each other a little bit by saying how much we actually love this album, because in a lot of ways it's one of the lesser known Pink Floyd albums. I think, don't you?
yeah. I mean, it took me a while. Like you challenged me to, not challenged me, but like you asked me, hey, is there an under like we didn't even talk about Pink that it being Pink Floyd at the time, but
No,
just like, hey, is there a favorite album or an underrated album or an album that you think should get more play, right? And I kind of went through this sort of a was that crisis of conscience, whatever. I don't know, like where I'm like, I really like Pink Floyd. They're my favorite band, but it's hard for me to recommend a, a Pink Floyd album because I, I cannot listen to them all the way through without feeling like I want to skip one here or skip one there
right.
because I'm just not in the place I was. I still love the band, but I'm not emotionally in the place I was, you know, when I was 25
I
and
can very much relate to that.
right. Like when my friends and I sat and listened to The Wall, you know, on a
Hmm.
mattress on the floor, in one of our new apartments, and yeah, so
And I
yeah,
can
so
relate
it's
to that. I mean, I think that's the case. I think with a lot of music acts that we view them differently depending on where we are in our lives. I look back at the whole grunge movement in the early '90s, and I was still in my 20s at that point, but I think I was part of that whole Generation X group that was written for. So I loved all that stuff, and a lot of the stuff like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, other bands from that era who were very, very popular and still remain popular was well, there was a lot of unhappiness in those lyrics. The era is known for being sort of this miserable era, of
hmm
just the musicians being miserable and a lot of the fans, being unhappy. But at that time, I remember my best friends and I sort of thriving on that. Like we would hear an artist. I remember when Alanis Morissette came out with her Jagged Little Pill album, and a lot of her songs were her being upset, about a
hmm
relationship or one thing or another. And we're just like, I remember my friend saying, listen to how miserable she is. This is great. Everybody's got to buy this album. I
yeah,
mean, it's funny how you go through periods. And I think it was the same with me for Pink Floyd. There were different times in my life where I don't know. I just appreciated a lot of those things, like The Wall and even Dark Side, a little bit more than I do now. I'm not in any way saying I don't appreciate it now. I think most of it is still brilliant, but I'm just in a place of my life where I'd rather hear uplifting things, or
yeah.
things that don't bum
Well,
me out.
it's even like where I was just thinking about it, where it's not like most popular songs aren't about happy things. I mean,
Yeah, that's
like
true.
you want to bring out negative emotions, but you hopefully have it brings you I guess it gives you the gift of hope, I guess, like
Yes. Yeah.
even though but some Pink Floyd, it's an endless, the album, like
Right.
a double album of negativity is a little bit can be tough, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting. I was thinking about best of albums, and I used to
Hmm.
have sort of a negative opinion of them. I'm like, for a lot of them, like there's some like I actually, when I got into Fleetwood Mac, I started with a best of album, right? So somebody had given me a best of album or something, or
Oh,
loaned
okay.
me one, and I thought, oh, that's nice. And then I sort of branched out into other things. Then I saw that there was a Pink Floyd. I don't know if they call them best ofs, but there's several compilations,
Yeah, yeah, I remember there being several
and I
compilations.
like turned up my nose. I'm like, why would there need to be a best of Pink
Yeah,
Floyd? Because like their songs don't stand alone. Like why would you like
that's
cut
very
one
true.
out and put them on here? And now I'm
Yeah,
thinking, well, now I understand why, because
yeah,
like now I might not my best of might not be the same as the ones that would sell,
right.
but I've
Yeah, but
certainly
I,
made my own best ofs Pink Floyd, in playlists and burned my
yeah,
own
me
CDs
too.
back in the day when so like I get it now.
And I agree with what you're saying here because there were times, especially when I was so immersed in their albums, which was most of my 20s and into my 30s, that, I knew them inside out. And if I, were to hear some sort of compilation album where I heard the song Time and then it's followed up by something that came 15 years later, I'm like, oh, that's wrong. That
Hmm.
is not how it plays out on the album. Time should only be followed by, whatever it was on the Dark Side of the
Yeah.
Moon album. I think it was the Great Gig in the
Yeah,
Sky, maybe.
there was one where it started with like it kicked it off um in the I think in the order that they were released. And like so
Hmm.
the first one on this best of or compilation was was Interstellar Overdrive or
Oh,
something,
okay.
right? They didn't dare put the earlier, the weirder ones like bike or SCM
Right.
replay, those kinds of things. But they're just weird, I'm like, if somebody buys this, they're gonna want to return it because it's just not
That's
because
true.
they're
That's
gonna
true.
go, this Interstellar Overdrive is so weird compared to, and I go, well, it doesn't belong on the same kind of an album as the other songs.
It's funny you're talking about that. I hadn't thought about this in years. I never owned a copy of this because I had already had the studio albums. But I remember one compilation being called "A Collection of Great Dance Songs."
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't think dancing and Pink Floyd usually in the same sentence. So it was a great ironic title, I thought.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
definitely.
now going back to the Obscured by Clouds album, it's interesting because, like we said, it was a soundtrack for a film, and the film, I'm not sure how to. I guess it was a French film, La Vallée. I'm not sure how
I
you
think it's
say
the
it.
La
The
Vallée. I don't
Valley.
know, but I think it's the Valley in French.
Yeah, and
But
also
I guess
it was released in some places as Obscured by Clouds as well.
well, yeah. So I guess they had a falling out with the production company,
Oh,
right?
okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the movie was The Valley, La Vallée, right? And Pink
Hmm.
Floyd was going to release the soundtrack also as La Vallée, but then they had a falling out, so they said, "Well, screw you. We're going to release it, as Obscured by Clouds,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Just
because
so it's
nowhere on the recording does it say the official soundtrack to, or at least I don't think it does. But go ahead.
I have seen. I somehow I knew even before Google existed. So I
Right.
mean, it must have said it in the liner notes or
Oh
something
yeah.
like that. They
Right.
probably had some sort of contractual agreement to
Yeah,
that
you're
it had
right.
to be in
Probably
there.
did.
I think it said the soundtrack to the film La Vallée, right? But
Right.
then the film production company decided, well, we're just going to change the name of the movie to Obscured by Clouds.
Oh, okay. How
Oh,
about that?
yeah, just to
Interesting.
to screw them back, right? Yeah. So, but you've never heard of either movie, so
Yeah.
obviously it wasn't a winner. I mean,
Yeah,
it could have been a great
the
movie.
only time you hear about the movies is when people like you and I are talking about the albums that were that came from
Yeah.
them.
Well, if we had heard about it, everyone would know that this was a soundtrack.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And now let's delve a little bit more into Obscured by Clouds because it is an album I think that not just Pink Floyd fans should check out, but just fans of good music. There's a lot of good
Hmm.
stuff on there. I mean, it starts off with a couple of instrumentals, which you can tell were it's no big surprise that
Soundtracky.
they were very soundtracky. It started off with a great one. With the title track "Obscured by Clouds," and it was a little different sounding in some ways from other things that Floyd was doing back then, but it was cool because it was a little mellow, but yet it still really rocked too. And it had
Hmm.
like a great David Gilmour solo on there. And it was a good all the songs in there are very short. I think the album clocks in at what maybe just over 30 minutes or somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Um, but that was a good one. And When You're In's another instrumental. And I know what your favorite is on the album. But what is your favorite song on the album?
Childhood's End.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
song. It's such a great song. It's I it's one of my favorite David Gilmour sung songs from that early period, and I would say actually from the entire history of Pink Floyd. His vocals on it are fantastic, and when I wrote an article last year about this album. I'll include a link to it in the notes for this episode on YouTube and in the other places, but it turned out that that was the last song that David wrote for Pink Floyd, where he was the sole writer until 1987 with the Momentary Lapse of Reason album, because it was after that like I said, I'm sorry, Roger Waters started taking like the primary lead role, and he for a couple albums, the others co-wrote some songs with him, but that
Hmm.
was mostly on the more musical end of it. But Childhood's End is just so good. I would love to have seen him do that in concert one of the times I saw Floyd, but it was never
Yeah.
popular enough, I guess, to warrant that. It's such a great song, though.
Yeah, it's definitely a deep cut for this for the fan, for the
Yeah,
fans. But it like it's one of the ones where I feel like if it could have gotten more play, it could have taken off as a song on its own because it's a rock song, right?
yeah, it
Where
is.
a lot of I think of what I'm sure we all know people who are like, oh, Pink Floyd, and roll their eyes at it because of like
Yeah,
it's got this epic progressive rock kind of stuff where it just kind of goes on forever and you never know, and
yeah,
trying too hard, but some people say, right? But
exactly.
Childhood's End and some of the earlier stuff, and then again some of their later stuff with Momentary Rhapsody and on, like it's more about their songs stand alone again, and they're
Hmm.
more rock songs.
Exactly. And actually, Childhood's End reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff from David Gilmour's solo albums. So he hasn't done a whole lot of solo albums, but there's an early. It was from his first solo album, this song called No Way Out of Here.
Hmm.
And it reminds me a little bit. Parts of that remind me of that song. Um, Gilmour's underrated, I think. I mean, he gets obviously a lot of acclaim for being such a fantastic guitarist. To me, he's one of my
Hmm.
favorite rock and roll guitarists ever. But his voice too, I think, is exceptional. I always
Yeah.
preferred his voice over. I like Roger Waters' voice, but I always preferred Gilmour's voice. And he did sing on the majority of, I would say their most popular songs. Great
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and he was very talented. I mean, he like when after Sid Barrett left, Sid Barrett went off and did I think one or two solo albums as well,
Yeah,
and David Gilmour produced them,
that's right. I forgot that.
and he played the drums.
Oh
Because
yeah, that's right.
Sid Barrett was a guitar player and had his own distinctive style, but
Yes, he
David
did.
Gilmour, like if you look at the liner notes for his albums, which are even they're super crazy.
They
So
are. Remember
yeah,
one was called the Madcap Laughs or
laughs,
something.
yeah,
Yeah, and that was
yeah,
really bizarre.
yeah.
That
So
was a
they're really
listen to it once,
bizarre.
and that was enough for me.
Yeah, exactly. You can catch some of those on YouTube,
Yeah.
and but David Gilmour plays a lot of the music, a lot of the instruments,
Well, and I didn't
as
real
well.
I think I had known that about him playing drums and other things on there, but I had forgotten that. Yeah, he's incredibly talented, and that's such a great song. And my favorite is also a Gilmour sung song, and that's it's a really interesting title. It's "What's the Deal?"
Yeah.
Question mark. And that I mentioned how I wish he had done Childhood's End in concert. He actually on one of his more recent solo tours. Well, gosh, I say more recent, but it was almost 20 years ago now. He had done What's the Deal in concert, and I've seen some videos of that online, and it's on one of his live albums that came out around 2004, 2005, and that is when he actually toured with Richard Wright, the
Hmm.
keyboard player and occasional vocalist. Rick passed away shortly after that, but on one of those last tours with Gilmour, they touched in on some of the old stuff like that and echoes from the metal album, and that to me is a great song. And that's like you had said for Childhood's End. I think if that had been released as a single, at least to like more rock stations, it could have gotten some notoriety and some extra fame on the band. And I know you can only play the what if game so much, but it makes me wonder, if those things had been released and been successful, would Dark Side have happened the way that it did? Would the record company have pushed them to go in another direction? Like I
Yeah,
said, I know you can only play What If so
I think it's
much,
like
but
could be also be like a timing thing, like
yeah,
because like the radio stations, like true like super fans, they just buy everything, right?
yeah,
Doesn't really
hmm,
matter what order they come in. But radio stations, they're only going to play the stuff that they're going to get listeners.
right,
So with dark, metal had recently come out, and I don't think it had any. I think it had a couple of songs that were got some
yeah,
airplay, but it wasn't like a huge. And then Dark Side of the Moon comes out. So sandwiched in between is this little album more that wasn't really getting a big push either, right?
right. Now,
So yeah, so maybe that's then Dark Side comes in and they're like in pretty short succession, and
yeah,
then and it was such a huge album.
it
Yeah.
always. I mean, yeah, it couldn't have been much more huge. I mean, it was in the top 200 album charts for gosh, I think it was from the time it was released up until the very end of the 1980s. For the longest time, it held a record for being, in the top 200 longer than any other album. But then it's funny, once I had seen I think it was the drummer Nick Mason talking about this. He said the reason that he felt that it finally did eventually exit the top 200 was at that point in the late 1980s, CDs were the most popular way to listen to music. And prior to that, though, people were wearing out their copies of their vinyl copies of Dark Side of the Moon. So they keep buying them over and over again. And I know that's true
Oh,
even for me. I owned 3 copies of it before I bought it on CD.
yeah.
One, it just was skipping too much, and the other
And
it got
tapes wear
kept
out.
on.
They start
Yeah,
sounding
yeah,
weird, or
exactly.
they do that thing where you got to put the pencil back in. Like that only happens so many times, and they give it a pinch in the wrong spot, and then you're
Exactly.
annoyed.
So yeah, that's what led the album to eventually making its way out of the top 200. But yeah, Dark Side was so epic and just life changing for the band in so many ways. I mean, their music. I mean, they went in some really, I thought, good directions after Dark Side. I mean, you had Animals, of course, and Wish You Were Here, and those were to me, those were the last 2 albums where it seemed more like group efforts,
Yeah.
because especially with the Wish You Were Here album, there are, well, the main song on there, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, is I think 17 or 18 minutes long. It's just, and most of it is instrumental, and I think it was co-written by, if not all of the band, it was most of the band, and that was
Hmm.
a very collaborative thing. But then when you came to The Wall in the 1970s, Roger kind of took the lead with all of the lyrics because it was mainly the story he was telling.
Hmm.
And I know even after that, I think the decision was, okay, Roger pretty much has to be running things because we had such success with The Wall. Although it didn't really go so well there, because after The Wall came the final cut, and David Gilmour barely did anything on there because Roger took over a little too much. And well, of course, Roger left right after that because it had gotten very, what was it? It wasn't a nice
Contentious.
scene. Yeah.
Well, I think the feeling was that the final cut was leftover feelings from the wall. It's like
Yes.
stuff that I couldn't get out of my system with the wall. I'm going to put in in the final cut. And I think the
Right.
band was like, we want to do something a little. Let's change it up a little bit. This is like the
Yeah.
wall too, almost, right?
Right.
And
And
then
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
he also I think Roger Waters wanted the pros and cons of hitchhiking. Have you listened to his
I
solo?
love that album. Yeah.
I love
Mhm.
it too. So he wanted that to be a Pink Floyd thing, and they're like, well, this is all about you. Like they're like, this is too personal. It's all about you. So they
Right.
pushed back, and that's when they settled on the final cut, I think,
Yeah.
and added a couple of more songs to make it thematically different. But yeah, I love the Roger Waters stuff too.
Yeah, I do too. The only one that I haven't really gotten into with that was the one that he put out in 2017, and
That
I
the
guess
opera
that is
one.
no, it was "Is This the Life We Really Want?" I guess was the album he came out with in 2017, and I don't want to. Well, I love his music. I don't want to put him down in any way because he's certainly entitled to have his opinions on things. But it seems like Roger has he's always been known for being a little on the grumpy side,
Hmm.
even in interviews going back to the 1960s. But it seems like most of the times you see him talking now, he's very very angry, and maybe angrier than ever about maybe things going on in the world and problems that he has had with the other surviving members of Pink Floyd. And I think when this album came out, I tried to listen to it once, but I'm like, as much as I love him, I'm just not. It's sort of like we said earlier. I just wasn't in the mood for it. I remember
Yeah.
putting it on, and instantly there was one of the first things I heard on there was a clip of then President Donald Trump speaking. He had like sampled something from his, and I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I don't really, I'm not feeling this. I want to, I'm okay with
I
concept
want to
albums.
escape from this stuff, not.
Well, and you just nailed it because I a lot of times I'll go to music because I want to get away from what's going on in the world. I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not trying to sound like I don't want to sound in any way like I'm narrow minded and trying to shut out the world, but sometimes you do want to get away from that stuff.
Yeah.
Music is a place I like to escape to.
And even then, like even when there is, I mean, definitely The Wall was political,
Oh yeah,
and
definitely.
Final Cut definitely political, but there was more allegories to. They didn't put real life people in it.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, in the
exactly.
Final Cut, there's a little bit of, but
Yeah,
it's
there's a
just
little bit. I think I'll talk about Thatcher
Ronald
and
Reagan and
some
Margaret
others.
Thatcher and stuff like
Yeah,
that. But it's a
yeah,
little bit abstract, and like it was about
right.
the Falklands War, like which most Americans aren't they knew about but didn't know.
Yeah.
So, but like you could take a little bit of that, but like I guess with an album starts off with something that's contentious with clips of a latest politician or something like that. That's gonna set it, and that's the timeline we're going with,
Yes. Yeah.
and so it's no longer
I
evergreen.
yeah, and I think that can be dangerous in whether it's music or TV or movies, to have the topical things like that. I remember you've probably seen it, the old TV show from the 1960s, the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Hmm.
I remember seeing an interview with the producer, the creator of that, Carl Reiner, where he said he intentionally back then did not want to make references to anything going on politically, or in the news because he wanted his show to hold up over the years. And I
Yeah.
think over the 5 years that they did Dick Van Dyke, there was one mention, I think, of then President John F. Kennedy. And the rest of the time, they stuck away from things. And here it is almost 60 years later, and the show is still shown on TV every day. And a lot of it holds up. And I think that could be the same for music, too. I know some people younger than me that I remember once playing some Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young for them, and Ohio came on, and I kind of had to explain the song Ohio to them because it took place about this students getting killed at this one university and this horrible tragic event. But I'm not saying, of course, that those things should never be done. There's reasons for doing that, and artists they feel passions about one thing or another, whether they are
Hmm.
musicians or writers or any kind of artists. But yeah,
Well,
sometimes that stuff might not hold up.
I can't even remember with the song, but it was recently. Like I learned that a song that I liked was about a specific situation. So I've been listening to whatever this song was, a big airplay song since the 70s. And then it was only like maybe 2 years ago that I'm like, oh, that was about a specific thing. And it was because I went and read the lyrics, and it was like one of those sites, lyrics meaning, and it's somebody had
Oh,
written, oh,
right.
this is a reference to this. And everyone there agreed, rarely, the one of those rare things, everyone agreed that it was about that. And
That
I'm
is
like,
rare online.
oh, I do know about this event, right? It was a big event, and I do know about the song, but I did not connect it because it was subtle. There were subtleties to the music.
Right.
So even if you didn't know the specific situation, like you can still enjoy the song,
Right.
um, and the messages that it's giving on
Exactly.
an allegory level, an allegorical level, maybe.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's one of the beauties of a musician being in a band like Pink Floyd. Because when you had a Roger Waters solo album, he's going to do what he wants to do, and that's wonderful. Artists should do what they want to do. Absolutely. That should come before, trying to get the sales and all of that. Tap into what's driving you, tap into what your passions are. But when you are in a band setting, you might have to stifle that a little bit and make things a little more subtle. And sometimes that could be, a more positive thing, I think, where I've had the same experience as you. There was something I was listening to the other day from the 80s. And, oh, you know what it was? It was Eddie Grant's Electric Avenue.
Hmm.
which is a great, you listen to it and musically it's this fun pop song. Everybody knows the chorus, gonna rock down to Electric Avenue. But it was actually like a very political song. And I
Mm.
didn't realize that till recently, that it was about, really hard times going on in the area that he was singing about, which I cannot remember right now. But yeah, sometimes though, when things are a little more subtle, I think that can be a plus.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where, like as a writer, sometimes you make playlists and you share them with your fans or put them on
Hmm.
social media. This is what I'm writing. This is like if I could have a theme song to my book,
Right.
this would be it. And I shared, Heart's Barracuda,
Oh yeah, yeah.
right? And
Great song.
somebody said, "But don't you know what that's about?" I'm like, "Well, I do, but like I only learned about it, like last year, what the song is about." Which was a negative experience that they had with their record label, accusing them of the two sisters of having a sexual relationship.
Oh
Like,
my goodness.
I know.
I have
And
never
they were
heard this
so pissed
before.
off about this that they left the
Whoa.
record company eventually, but they were also like made this song about this, right? So I'm like, but yeah, but I loved the song for 20 years, right? And
Wow.
it's this like rockin' song that I
Yeah.
had in my mind. So I'm not going to let that ruin it for me. Like, yeah, I recognize that song, what the song is about. I appreciate it for what it is, but
Right.
you know, it's the same. Like, if you look at I love Guardians of the Galaxy, all those movies, right?
Hmm.
And they have great soundtracks,
Oh yeah. Exceptional
but
soundtracks.
those songs don't always match. Like the theme of the song doesn't always match up with that. Like could be a huge conflict, but it's the emotion that the song has brought up with the audience that's more important than the actual message of the song.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. I never heard that about Barracuda, and like you, that's something that I think I was maybe 10 or 11 years old when that song came out, and hearing that on the radio, I was like, oh, it's just about a barracuda, Arr. It's just like
Yeah.
an
Well, and
animal.
they probably never shared what it was about until like
Yeah,
10,
probably
15 years
not.
later in an
Yeah.
interview. And like people, you listen to an interview with Nancy Wilson now and she talks about the origins of that. But
Yeah,
but
it's
she's
interesting.
but she's not singing it as if that's what happened. Like, like if you look at the
Hmm.
look on her face when she's singing it, she's not bitter and angry,
Right.
about that. She's like, marching forward. It's just, it's like a
It is
we're
interesting.
we're kicking ass.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you find those sorts of stories online too. I think there's I haven't visited it in a long time, but I assume it's still around. A website called Song Facts, and
Mm.
you could pretty much type in any song title, and if there was a story behind it, you could find it on the site. And I saw one thing after another along the lines of what you just said. It can be interesting to see where things come from, and a lot of the things were based around problems the artists had, with their record executives or their agents and things like that. There was something recently, gosh, I can't remember what it was right now, but what song it was, but there was a Steely Dan song like that, where I had been hearing the story one way in my head for decades, but then I
Hmm.
found out it was actually much, much deeper than what I thought. And you're right, the artists certainly don't have to share that with the public, but it is interesting when you learn those things. And like we said, as far as Pink Floyd goes, especially the stuff that came in the 70s from that Roger Waters wrote, I know that they had a lot of basis in reality and not
Hmm.
always political, but I know he also had, I think, gone through it a really hard divorce. He may have had an affair on his wife. I can't remember, but I think some of that had worked its way into his music, even, not just with Floyd, but I think even on the Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking album.
That one's definitely some sort of sexual thing going on, right? This whole
Yeah,
with a sexual and then a family situation and
yeah,
then
Pros
road
and
trip
Cons.
and stuff like that. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely
I
and
really want to.
and
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
oh no, like and like to bring it back to like uh, like have a cigar is very much like like
Yes,
problems with you know
right.
agents and record companies and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Like
exactly,
that as well.
exactly. That's such a
Yeah.
great song. I love that song. That was an interesting one in that none of the Pink Floyd members actually sang lead on that. It was another
Yeah.
guy named Roy
R-
Harper.
Yeah.
Is that it? Is
Yeah.
that right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, it was interesting. And I heard later that Waters said he kind of regretted that. that he says maybe I should have just sang that myself, but Roy Harper did a
I
great job on it.
mean, it's interesting. It was years before I realized I was always wondering which of the three sang that, right?
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until because it didn't, I think I mean, I had the album, the physical vinyl
Hmm.
of, and for those younger people out there today, like you may not realize how much information they put on these
Oh yeah.
albums that they really didn't put in CDs, right?
Yeah.
So, and they certainly don't put them in MP3s, right? And
Now,
so, like, there's no
I do
booklet
miss
or
that kind of
book,
stuff.
so like it probably had vocals by Roy Harper on for
Right.
having, so it could have, but it certainly didn't have the story that they wanted they wanted somebody else to represent, not
Yeah.
them.
Right.
And Roy Harper was in the next studio, and they said, "Hey, Roy, can you come over and do this?"
Yeah, I saw Roger Waters solo 3 times. One of the times I saw him, he did do that song, which was kind of neat to hear him sing it, and he did a
Oh
fantastic
yeah,
job of it. But did you ever see Waters or Pink Floyd?
I've seen
Live?
Pink Floyd 3 times and Roger Waters twice.
Oh, nice, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about. Yeah, I think. Yeah, for me, it's 3 and 3. I saw Floyd twice on the Momentary Lapse of Reason
Hmm.
tour, and then once on Pulse, and they were just amazing each time. And Waters was too. I saw him. I want to say it was around '99 or 2000. He was not plugging a particular album at that point because his most recent one had been Amused to Death, which came out in '92. So it was just really a collection of his solo stuff and Floyd stuff, and that's when he seemed like he was really getting into enjoying touring because since then he's toured pretty regularly. I
I
know.
saw him for Radio Chaos,
Oh, I would have loved to have seen that.
and which was interesting because radio Jim Ladd, who's the radio personality
Yeah, the
in
DJ.
the booth,
Yeah.
in the DJ, he was actually the local radio DJ for Los Angeles. So like
Oh,
there was a
okay.
station KMET, which was the big progressive rock, classic rock. I know they probably didn't call it classic rock at the time, but rock station,
Right.
right? At the time, he was famous, and he had, Jim Ladd was a regular DJ, but he also had his own special shows that he would do Friday
Oh,
night. He had
okay.
one called Headsets, where he encouraged everyone to put on your headset because like the stuff
Oh,
that we're going to
nice.
play requires that much immersion,
Oh,
right?
I love that.
And so he was the DJ, and for the concert, actually had a DJ booth. So there was like a DJ booth up there,
Oh,
and
wow.
he did it like so. The members of Roger Waters' band got to have their own tracks that they played. So Paul Carrick from Squeeze was
Oh,
there.
that's right. I forgot he toured with him then.
Yeah, so he got,
Yeah.
two song. He got a song here, like at the beginning, near the beginning, and then another song later on, and then
Oh, wow.
thematically, and like so, it was kind of like they had an opening act, and David Sanborn,
Oh, oh, yeah.
which was a strange, not a typical kind of a thing for rock, right?
Yeah.
But he got up there and he played a couple stuff. He went out there with David Sanborn and Paul Carrick, and they did some stuff together.
Wow.
And there were some big names that got to, do some stuff. So they
Oh,
made it
that's
like a
very
radio
cool.
show kind of. It was pretty cool.
Oh, I bet that was a lot of fun. I would have loved to
Yeah.
have seen that. I
Yeah,
would have
and then
liked
like
to.
introducing like then he would shift from here's a Roger Waters to do this, and then like the Roger Waters songs were more like the like the story, and then Jim would introduce a Pink Floyd song, and then they would all do that,
Oh,
or here's Paul
wow.
Carrick, here's a Squeeze song by Squeeze, and
Oh,
it was
wow.
pretty cool.
That sounds very cool. And I may be wrong on this, but I want to say that at the time he was touring for that, Floyd was out on the road touring too for one of their first solo.
I think
One of their
Momentary
first.
Lapse of Reason
Yeah, I
and
think it was
Radio
Momentary
Chaos came
Lapse.
out at the same time,
Yeah, I
basically the
think they
same
did.
time.
Yeah, yeah, and because I remember there was a really good Pink Floyd book. I think it was actually called A Saucer Full of Secrets that came out in the late 80s or early 90s that talked about that. How I think the writer of the book, he was in communication with both camps, for the work that he was doing on this book, and he said it was really interesting because I think some people viewed him I forget who it was. It was somebody with Waters' organization who was like, "Oh, do we really want him here? Because we know he's been talking to David Gilmour. Because Gilmour and Waters, were just boom, just at each other for years over. Well, there were lawsuits over who could
Yeah.
tour as Pink Floyd at that point, and it got pretty ugly. And unfortunately, it's still ugly. I don't know if you knew about this, but Waters is about to release his own version of The Dark Side of the Moon. He's coming out with a solo album of that, where I think it's. I think I heard him say that he's doing this as sort of how someone his age now would be presenting this material, and
Yeah, I'm torn
I
because
am too.
I don't think it'll make the other Dark Side sell less because it's
Yeah,
he okay, so Taylor Swift is redoing her stuff to get her rights back, right? So she
right,
right, and she's trying to make them sound exactly the same as the originals, right?
right.
So people will just listen to the her versions instead of the old versions. But I think Roger Waters is trying to do it at, like you said, as if somebody would do it now. So
Hmm.
I think it will be fine, but I think it's going to bump up sales of the original too.
I do too. I do
So
too.
do I have a problem? I don't really have a problem with it.
Yeah,
um I
yeah.
I I
I'll give it a listen, but I'll probably, I don't know. I don't think that it's really necessary, but again, do what you want to do. I remember there was something else recently with Dark Side. I don't know if Pink Floyd was putting out a anniversary edition of it, and there was some problem with the liner notes where I think Waters pretty wanted to take over what the Pink Floyd organization was doing with it, and he was just. I remember reading a couple interviews where he said, "The Dark Side of the Moon is mine. It's my work." And
yeah.
it's I don't like I said, it's gotten so ugly and it's been going on for I guess close to 40 years now. I mean, there've been times when they've reunited for one or two small occasions, but it's been
And as a
ugly.
fan, it's like I get excited like when I feel like, oh, finally, because there was a time when
Yeah.
Roger Waters apologized. He said, you know what,
Yes.
I was a jerk. I think he used really harsh words. I don't want to give you an explicit tag here, but he said I was a
Yeah.
right. I shouldn't have done those things. I ruined maybe the relationship would have been rocky, but I really ruined the relationship by what I did. I was a bitter, angry man at that time. And I
Hmm.
regret a lot of the stuff I did. So he's clearly still bitter and angry about stuff. Like, so, maybe that sort of helped for a while, but
Right.
then, things are sort of back to
Yeah. It's a
contentious
shame.
again. But I think David Gilmour says I'm done being Pink Floyd now. So like maybe
Yeah.
they're just maybe the fighting will go away or because there's not as much to fight about.
Yeah, yeah, you would hope so. And unfortunately, as is the case, with time passing, you have band members who unfortunately have passed away, like Richard Wright has, and all of these guys I think are well into their 70s at this point. So, I don't want to ever tell anyone how to live their lives, but it'd be nice if you could find ways to push aside that anger. If even if you're not going to record
Uh,
again together or do a concert together, maybe make some sort of peace.
yeah. Well, I would definitely go. And I think Nick Mason still does some sort of touring. I saw
He
something where
does,
he's
yeah.
got a Pink Floyd esque band, sort of like the Ringo
Yeah,
Starr experience, but with the Nick Mason
exactly.
experience. I think it's called The Saucer Full of Secrets, maybe, or
I
something
think
like
it
that.
is. Yeah, and I think he's covering the pre-Dark Side period, the early stuff with his
Yeah.
band. Yeah, it's interesting. I love when I see that because the drummer for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Carl Palmer, is doing a similar thing right now, where he's been out touring with his own new band, doing the Emerson, Lake and Palmer stuff. Which is I like when I see that. They have respect for their legacy. They know the fans still want to hear it, even if it's not the whole band. That's kind of
Well,
nice.
I think like if David Gilmour, like I think it's a totally different experience. So if Roger Waters goes and makes the Pink Floyd experience, or David Gilmour makes a Pink Floyd experience,
Right.
totally different things versus Nick Mason, who's the drummer. He's going to pick people, and people are not going to expect David Gilmour guitar, David Gilmour voice, Roger Waters bass. Like
Right.
it's going to be a more fun experience,
Exactly.
and I think it's the drummer is the one that's just sort of
Yeah.
he's keeping them on an even keel. He's keeping everybody on an even keel.
Yeah.
And I've seen interviews with him and with Nick, and he seems like a sort of like a fun, more lighthearted.
He does, yeah.
guy. Same with Ringo Starr. I
Yeah.
love Ringo Starr.
They both
And
seem like the one that everybody in the band kind of got along with, and he kept up relations with them, even though they may have been feuding with each other. Nick was still there for David. He was still there
mhm,
for Roger, and yeah, it's interesting. And I think I completely agree with you. I think you nailed it in that it would be much different if it was David Gilmour out on the road saying David Gilmour's Pink Floyd, and he had just somebody else singing, Roger Waters songs and such. It would not be maybe held in as good of a view by a lot of fans as say the Nick Mason project is going. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Certainly
not saying I
interesting.
wouldn't go see these
Oh,
things.
I know. Same thing, same thing. It's like I don't buy all of Roger Waters' stuff because, as we've talked about before, it's still
Yeah,
too bleak. And
yeah,
I listen to them. I've
right.
listened to them to see.
Yeah,
Um, I think I've bought all of David Gilmour stuff, but most of the new Pink Floyd basically feels like a lot of David Gilmour stuff
yeah, it
to
does.
me. I have to say that I prefer, I mean, there's like you talk about different phases, right? So there's the early Pink Floyd, there's the middle Pink Floyd, which is like for me is like the More album to Dark Side of the Moon.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I'd
And
say
then
that's a good
the
middle period.
Wall and Final Cut, I like them both, but I don't won't listen to them. They're so thematic and not
Mm-hmm.
where I am in life these days
Yeah.
that every once in a while I'll listen to them. But and then A Momentary Lapse of Reason on is like totally, it's like when Rush came out with Moving Pictures was the last one for me with Rush, and then it was a new phase after that.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
think
Definitely a different phase for Floyd
Momentary
after
Lapse of
that.
Reason, but I kind of put Momentary Lapse of Reason as in its own category because David Gilmour still wrote a lot of the lyrics,
Yeah.
and I don't think he's a brilliant lyricist. I think he's okay. Like I don't
I,
think I
I
could
feel
do
the same
better,
way.
but I think his stuff is like not as, I go, ooh, that's a harsh. That's all. That's not the best lyric. But I live learning to fly, and then I think it's, I don't know whether his wife or his partner,
That's
whatever,
right. Polly
Polly.
Sampson, I think it is.
I
Yeah.
think she's the primary lyricist after Momentary Lapse of Reason,
Yeah.
and I think it's fine, but it's like
Yeah.
it feels like a
It's a totally different thing.
totally different thing.
Yeah.
And
That later stuff I appreciate probably a little bit more for the music than for the lyrics of it. There's a
yeah,
lot of good stuff on there. Like I love the Division Bell, the last studio
yeah,
album that they did. There, of course, there was the Endless River that came later, which is mostly instrumental except for one song, and I love that. There's very little that I don't love by them, but I'm revisiting it less and less now.
yeah, yeah. I'm much more likely to, even though I hated compilations before, I'm much more likely to make a playlist and listen
Yeah,
to them all
I
than
think
than I am a whole album.
and thankfully that's so easy for us to do now with things like Spotify, and
Yeah,
it's so much easier than the old mixtape days. But you know what?
yeah.
I could probably talk Pink Floyd with you for the rest of the day, but I'm probably going to wrap this one up right now. And I
Okay.
just wanted to ask you, well, let's see, of the solo albums, you said you liked Roger Waters' early things quite a bit. Did
Oh,
you did you
I
have
had them all. I had Nick Mason's
oh, you had Nick
and
Mason's also?
Richard Wright, and I've had not a solo album, but he had an album with somebody else.
Yeah, yeah. He
Mason and Fenn was one, and then Richard Wright had one.
yeah.
They were unusual.
They
Those
were. I
solo
know he
albums.
put out two. That it's funny. You read my mind there because I was going to ask you what you thought about the other artists. Because we had talked about Waters so much. If you had heard any of those, because they're hard to find. I mean, I imagine they're easier to find now through YouTube and streaming services. But I had to pay a lot of money for Richard Wright's first solo album, which I think it came out in '78 or '79. It was called Wet Dream,
Mhm.
and yeah, I spent a fortune on that back in the 80s. I had to get it as an import, and
Yeah,
it
it
was
was an
good.
import, and I found it in one of those high fidelity style record stores.
Oh, okay.
You know,
But there was some good stuff there. I mean, I
yeah,
encourage people to check out the solo works because it's I don't have to everybody already knows this. These bands and artists are much more than just the songs you hear on the radio or the streaming services that are out there. Yes, there's some good solo stuff there. Particularly, I like to push David Gilmour's solo albums on people too because I think he does them very infrequently, but he's got some good stuff out there.
I really liked his first solo album. I enjoyed his
Hmm.
second one too, which I think was his first one was super mellow. It's
Yeah,
almost
it was.
like like a Steely Danish
Yes.
kind
Yeah.
of thing. His second one had more like I think he was more of a trying to get some airplay maybe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I think his third one was so many years later, right?
It was many years later because the second one, that was when that was sort of in between the final cut and when they came back with momentary lapse of reason in '87. I think everyone was trying to jumpstart their solo careers at that point because it had Love on the Air on it, which was a
Yeah,
good
that's the
song.
one. Yeah.
I actually liked that song quite a bit, and then a song in there that called Murder that got some play on some rock stations. That was a good one. And what was the other one that came out many years later? On the Island? Does that sound right? Or
Yeah, and that was
On
the one
an
that came
Island?
on an island, came out so
Yeah.
many years later. And I
Yeah, and that's
think,
actually really good. I didn't hear that
yeah,
until probably just the last 5 or 6 years. And thank goodness for streaming services because I didn't feel like spending the money on it, but I was able to hear it there. I
yeah.
spent
So I
money
think,
on it, but lesser than I would have if I bought it.
yeah, I think a lot of these, uh, David Gilmour's, he's so mellow. Like, so his, like, d- do they still say new age music? I don't know if they use
I'm
that
not
term, but
sure. Yeah, I think
do
they
you
might.
remember when
Yeah.
new age music came out and
Oh,
every
yeah. It was
local
all the big
had
thing
a,
for a while.
right? And yeah, that kind of, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So I feel like
Right.
some of David Gilmour's stuff could go on those,
I think you're right.
right? Including learning to fly, like, could be on
Yeah.
that too. People were like, oh, it's a little bit not as rocking as Pink Floyd should be.
Yeah. And even
But
on, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no,
Even the third solo album we were just talking about, I remember that has long periods on it where it's mostly instrumental, and I was having some meditation sessions while listening to that, which definitely
mhm.
falls into what you're talking about, more like the new age kind of laid back, just real peaceful sounding music. But yet there's still moments on there where he would just rip out a guitar solo and it's like, oh yeah, he's just
Yeah, yeah.
amazing, he's never lost it.
Such a distinctive guitar.
Yeah, definitely, he'll always be one of my favorite guitarists. And I thank you so much for being on the show. I mean, we really, it's just like we said at the beginning. We knew we could keep talking about Pink Floyd for a long time. I love talking music with you. There's so many other bands I know you and I could talk about, and some obscure things too that I know that we both like like Orion the Hunter.
Oh, I know.
All right, if you listeners aren't familiar with Orion the Hunter, look up Orion the Hunter, and also look up the Pink Floyd music we've talked about here today. I really encourage people to check out Obscured by Clouds if they're not familiar with it. It's a
Yeah, and if you want a
fantastic album.
Final Tap experience, I want you to go back and look at some early because they had music videos like
Yes.
from their early stuff, and it like you get to see these guys in all their glory, in all their
Yeah.
'60s, early '60s glory.
Yeah. I found one for, I want to say it was even for the song Bike that you mentioned earlier,
Yeah, that's a
which,
crazy one.
yeah. And,
And
most of my life, I didn't
Arnold
know the,
Lane, it's like a
yeah.
early Monkeys video where they're all like running around chasing each other, and you're like, this is
Yeah.
Pink Floyd acting goofy like
I
that.
know. So yeah, go to YouTube or wherever and look for these things. They're very, very entertaining and listen to this old stuff. There's so much good music prior to Dark Side of the Moon, particularly Obscured by Clouds, and now I want to go and listen to more again too. So I'm glad we talked about that.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
absolutely.
Roland, thank
Yeah.
you so much for being on the show. I encourage my listeners and watchers to seek out Roland. If you're watching this, you're on YouTube right now. And I know if you type in Roland's name on YouTube, you're going to see him pop up a lot because I've seen you as a guest on multiple shows over the
Yeah,
years and also with podcasts. And it was a real pleasure having you on here. And I hope you'll return again someday, Roland.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. And everyone, thank you for watching. If you ever want to listen, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to just listen to the audible versions of the show sometimes, like I said earlier, this is the 10th episode of Gotta Pop, but there are 9 others that are available on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, all those fun podcast places. So thanks again to everybody, and thank you, Roland. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, buddy.
Everybody take care.